Still 12:04, but I'm going to go rogue and just get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for Graduate Science Policy at UMD's Science Policy webinar today. Before we get going, I will just go over some webinar etiquette. First off, this is being recorded so that we can post it to our website at a later date. So if you have any qualms about being recorded, you can keep your video turned off. If you have a question and you don't want to ask it directly, you can message it to me and then I can ask it. But yes, this is being recorded. Please keep yourself muted at all times unless you're asking a question. If you do want to ask a question, please just type the word stack into the chat, and then I will call on you in the order that the questions are being asked. So just like that. So the setup today is going to be, we're going to start by having our three speakers each give a brief introduction about themselves. Then I'm going to ask our three speakers a series of questions that I think are broadly relevant to the topic of our webinar. And then finally, we will open it up to questions from all the participants. And at that point, if you do have a question, you would go ahead and type stack in the chat window. So again, thank you very much, everybody, for participating. I'm really excited to introduce our three speakers today. We have Melissa Varga from the Union of Concerned Scientists, Brittany Webster from the American Geophysical Union, and Kavita Surana from the UND School of Public Policy. So I'm going to start off and have Melissa, please, if you want to introduce yourself and start talking. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to virtually be online with all of you today. My name is Melissa Varga. I'm the Community Manager and Partnerships Coordinator for the Science Network at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And my path to science advocacy and policy is probably a little different than most other folks who are on the line today. I'm not a scientist. My background is in political organizing. I was bitten by the political bug in high school watching West Wing, but also hearing about the Iraq War in the news and being bombarded by political ads growing up in Ohio during the 2000 and 2004 elections. I was really into politics, and when I went to college, I thought I wanted to be a political speechwriter. And I got really involved in campaigns on campus and also running voter registration drives and walking students to the polls. I was super into it. I loved campaigning, and I moved to DC to get my master's in political management to try to figure out what the next step in my political career was going to be. But ironically, in DC, when I should have been the most energized and excited about politics, I started getting really burned out. And it took a class on grassroots mobilization to help me figure out what the problem was, that I was getting tired of this transactional nature of electoral politics. And I really wanted to get back to organizing people around the issues that they cared about, and specifically training them about how to get more involved in making a difference through policy. And that's what really led me to the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've been with UCS for about 6 years now. UCS, for a little bit of background, is a science advocacy nonprofit. We were started a little more than 50 years ago by a group of graduate students at MIT. At the time, they were seeing a lot of their research funding going towards weapon systems, and they thought that more funding for science should be used to help solve society's problems. And more than 50 years later, we are still operating under that ethos, advocating for science-based solutions through policy for a healthier planet and a safer world. And our staff right now includes scientists, analysts, engineers, economists, as well as lobbyists who help make sure that science-based policies are being represented on the Hill and in state legislatures around the country. Over the past 6 years, my role has been to help build their science network, which is our community of scientists, engineers, public health experts, other technical experts, and grad students who want to use their skills to push for better, more equitable science-based policies. In fact, some of you may be Science Network members. You may have gotten emails from me through UCS, so thank you for reading. And my goal at UCS is to help scientists understand how they can more effectively advocate for science-based policies. And we do this on two fronts. We offer trainings and resources and leadership development opportunities to help scientists understand the policymaking process, how they fit into the policymaking process, and then how to influence that in positive ways. And then we connect scientists with opportunities to get involved directly in the policymaking process on the issues that they care about. One example I wanted to highlight, one issue that we've been working on is more equitable energy storage policy. And by that, I mean we're looking at a broad range of criteria for the policy, including emissions reductions, local economic development, and ensuring participation of community members. In coordination with large, diverse group of stakeholders, we developed this guiding set of principles on equitable energy storage. It's such a mouthful, but it's so important. And we're training scientists on how to talk about this with legislators. And there's actually a good chance that a policy on energy storage will be coming up in the next legislative session in Maryland in 2021, where it will be really important for scientists and engineers to weigh in with legislators and the media on the value of this type of policy. So if that's something you're interested in, please follow up with me afterwards. But with that, I look forward to hearing your questions and your ideas about how you'd like to get more involved in policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Brittany, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Webster, and I am the program manager at AGU for our public affairs department, which is kind of like our science policy department. And in that role, I'm actually a lobbyist for AGU and our community of about 110 Earth and space scientists, around the world. Now, science, about 40% of our members are actually international now. So, we're no longer American and we're not really a union. So our name is a little deceiving. But how I got to my position is kind of like Melissa. I've had an unconventional role or path in science policy, and I'm actually a lawyer by training. And the last science class I took was, I think, at least well-timed, weather and climate, when I was in college. But when I was in law school, something I was really interested in was environmental policy, and specifically working on renewable energy policy. But I graduated like a very similar time. It was not a great economic time, and I had a really hard time finding a job. The legal market had really just kind of crashed. But I got an opportunity to do a fellowship on the Hill with a member of Congress who sat on the House Science Committee. And that was kind of as close as I could get to, what I had envisioned for myself post law school. And he sat on the space subcommittee as well as the research and technology subcommittee. So kind of focusing on NASA and largely NSF issues. And it just turned out that I loved it. I always tell people it sounds kind of simple, but getting to talk to people every day who were doing things I couldn't even imagine, especially the physics of putting things in space. How cool was that? Later I learned about, how sexy Earth science data is and stuff like that. But initially it was just, how awesome science is. But I noticed when I talked to a lot of scientists, they weren't really the best at communicating that. As someone who comes from a lawyer background, I think communication is everything for being a lawyer. You're always trying to persuade someone that you're right. And so when I left the Hill, I really wanted to stay in the science world. And so I worked for a nonprofit lobbying firm for a while. I worked on a senatorial campaign for a while, and then I wound my way to HU, which was really my dream job and continues for the most part to be my dream job. And I started as a senior specialist, and then I've kind of moved up a little bit to program manager now, where I lead and really help to lead the development of our policy and legislative strategy. And I really lead our Hill strategy. And so that consists of what really dominates a lot of my time are our policy priorities. We kind of set them at the beginning of each year and really kind of focus on where do we really want to move the needle this year for Earth and space science. So for this year and every year, funding is a huge priority. You know, if we don't have funding, none of the other stuff really matters. So funding and the agencies we really focus on are NASA, NOAA, NSF, USGS, DOE Office of Science, ARPA-E. Our newest area is really environmental health sciences, so the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and a little bit of EPA, as well as Forest Service. So really the full gamut, Earth and space science. And so that's one of our policy priorities. Another one is diversity, equity, inclusion, really building that 21st century workforce. AGU as a scientific society has really been a leader in this space. You know, it started with harassment, but now it's really just expanded to how do we create those good policies that make sure that everyone and anyone who wants to be, you know, a future AGU member has that opportunity. As well as resiliency. So many of our members study climate change, but also natural hazards from landslides to tornadoes. And you know, natural hazards are something everyone can relate to. I bet you most of us check the weather every single morning, but we take it so for granted that it's on our cell phone. So continuing to make sure that people see that, you know, the science doesn't come from nowhere, and it's really important. And then finally, lastly, scientific integrity. And we work a lot with UCS on this one. But really, this is something we've been battling a lot, I think, a lot normally on like an administrative regulatory level, but just ensuring that sound science is recognized for the value that it is and making sure that sound science can continue to operate. You know, I think the scientific process and peer review, you know, we lead in those. And so I think making sure that those processes are able to continue operating without, let's say, lots of undue interference. So those are our policy priorities. And so trying to move those at all levels on the federal level. We only operate on the federal level for the most part. We do a little bit of local work, and we're actually trying to get into more international policy to reflect our membership, the realities of our membership. We also have a full grassroots suite of activities we do. I'm a big believer, and I tell people all the time that the only way you're going to understand policy is getting into policy. Like, you got to do something. And so for a lot of our members, the thing that I like really try to make sure that we offer a lot of opportunities for our congressional visits days. And we do several throughout the year with different focuses. And really, they provide training, but then also really a real hands-on approach to kind of leading you to your first congressional meetings. I tend to think that once you've done that or you have that kind of experience under your belt, anything else in the policy realm is really easy. And we offer a whole host of opportunities from congressional science fellowships, which are year-long, to just, you know, calling your legislator 5-minute activities, I would say. Yeah, and so I would say AGU, I've talked a little bit about it, but the thing that most people know us for, I'll say, is our fall meeting. I think last year was like 28,000 people, and it's really just, we're the largest Earth and Space Science Society. And I think we see our role as a society as really, what are those niches or kind of holes in the scientific community, and how can we kind of provide those resources to make sure that our scientific enterprise is as strong as possible. So, you know, things like diversity, equity, inclusion, career center, experiences for students, leadership opportunities, those kinds of things. And I look forward to taking all of your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Finally, Kavita.
Great, thank you. And such a fantastic panel. I have to say, the one thing that I do have in common with Melissa and Brittany is that I also have a non-conventional path to science policy. So it makes me wonder who has a conventional path. But that aside, so I'm at the School of Public Policy at UMD in the Center for Global Sustainability. My research, so I do research on science and technology policy, and my research is largely in the climate and energy space, but it is also just more broadly on science and technology policy. And before I talk about what our center does, I'll give a background on myself. So I have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD, all of them in science and engineering. So when I was studying physics for my bachelor's, this was in India, and I did an internship in a think tank which worked on energy access. And I was working on solar cells at the time. This was a while ago, and at the time, people talked about solar as a technology to provide access to people who don't have who are not connected to the grid, and that was about 300 million people at the time. So in that experience, I felt that technology, working on science and making solar or similar technologies cheaper and more efficient, is a way to really address societal problems. And the way I want to do it is through science. So after my undergrad, I went for a master's and PhD, both in material science and engineering, and both of them were related to energy. I worked on making new generation, more quantum technology, quantum dot solar cells, and all that stuff. I was very excited about it. I was very excited about technology. I was surrounded by people who said the goal of their PhD is to patent and to have a technology that they can commercialize and to have startups and all of that. But in that process of being excited about the technology, I realized that for clean energy especially, it doesn't work that way. You can have the best science and the best technology, but maybe nobody would want it because it's too expensive, or the policies are not right, or the markets are not in place. And this was also a little bit around the time, for anybody who is familiar with the solar industry, that worldwide it collapsed in the early 2010s. And so worldwide it collapsed, whereas it really took off in China. So I also kind of was part of the setup where I wanted to work in science and technology, wanted to maybe work in industry doing R&D, something like that, but that possibility did not exist. Also, I was in Europe, so it wasn't in the US. It was just a completely different environment. So I was looking for a job while recognizing that science and technology is not the only way of addressing societal issues, and it's really important to understand the big picture. So I ended up in a management consulting company for a couple of years, where they analyze power markets and advise investors on which technologies or which power plants to invest in. And that experience was eye-opening for me, because it was completely unrelated to all that I had done until then on solar R&D. I realized just how complicated power markets are and policies that are in place, and investors really just care about the money. And so you need policy incentives to make technologies like solar cheaper. Or so it just gave me a really nice big picture view of the energy industry. But I still kind of wanted to go back to doing research and thinking about the big picture on clean energy technologies. How do you really advance the science, and then how do you take it to market? And what's the role of policy in that? So I applied for a fellowship, or I did a fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School. They have a postdoctoral program on science, technology, and public policy, where they have people from all over the world and all different backgrounds, really thinking about these interactions between science and technology and policy. So I was there for a couple of years, building up this completely new world of social science research on science and innovation, which is different from doing the science and technology and innovation. So after the postdoc, I still wasn't sure if I wanted to be an academic. I've kind of gone back and forth between academia and not. So I moved to DC and I worked at the World Bank for a while on again on energy climate issues, but also on innovation. And what that does is gave me a more practical experience on how our organizations or groups that are really thinking about linking what happens in science with what happens in society. How do they actually think about it, and how do they design policies and programs around it? And after that, I joined the Center for Global Sustainability at UMD. So as the center mostly works on broader climate and energy issues, we do a lot of both research, academic research, and reports on things related to climate and energy. So for example, a recent really big work that came out of the center was on analyzing America's pledge, which is a lot of states, subnational actors pledged to given their pledges to stick to the Paris Agreement commitments. And so our center quantified with other partners what that means in terms of emissions impact. So that's one example of the work that the center does. I lead the innovation work there. So something recently that I worked on was looking at the US broadly and looking at regional innovation in the US. So how different states think about clean energy innovation and who are the local stakeholders involved, what do they do, and then how can that have an impact. I also do a lot of, so these were reports, but I also do a lot of academic writing. There are journals that really focus on science policy. There are NSF programs that focus on science policy. So that's kind of my world now, where I'm really interested in how what can research tell us about science and how to do what it's called research on research. So science of science or research on research. And that's what I mostly do now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now we're going to move on to questions for all of our panelists. And I will read the question out, but I'll also type it into the chat box so everybody can look at it as well. And Kavita, you can start for the first question since you have the mic, so to speak. So what are some of the obstacles that scientists have to overcome to discuss their research with decision makers? What resources are available from your organization or other organizations to better prepare scientists to talk to policymakers?
So I can speak from my perspective on this. The biggest challenge was just communicating as a scientist, I felt that what I thought was important was not actually important from the policymaker's perspective. So that is something I had to learn because I didn't really have this formal setup moving from science to working on policy research or policy relevant things. But so communication has been the biggest obstacle. In the policy school, there are several, right now, and also when I was at Harvard, there are several tools that we learn to communicate better. Even though I don't do science and engineering research anymore, it's still research and it still needs to be communicated. So how do you do that? And then there are ways, so you learn how to write op-eds, you learn how to, well, you don't really learn, but I've often gotten this advice that you have to tweet and all of that. I'm personally not very good at doing that. then writing for general audiences is really important. So those are things that are promoted generally in a public policy school. I think that's I also have some ideas on what those resources are, where it's useful to publish or write, and I can share them with the group if there's any interest in that.
Yeah, maybe if you have a list of resources, if you send it to me, I could share it with everybody who participated.
Yeah, so I wrote down a few that I know of that are also relevant for communicating science policy research. So I think they would be relevant for this group.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. So I'll send that along to everybody if you can send it to me. Great. Melissa, do you want to go next?
Sure, and this is definitely building off of Kavita's comments. So I think about it as getting the right information to the right person at the right time and keeping it very short. So the right information is, trying to understand your audience and what they need, and usually that's connecting it back to that elected official or decision makers district or constituents, right? So like, what are the local impacts that they're going to be hearing about? The right person may not always be the legislator themselves. Often it's the staffer, which I'm sure Brittany can speak more to. And you can usually find out who the right person is on a particular issue by looking at just Googling the decision maker and their office. And the right time I find to be the hardest one to figure out, because you do generally have to have a sense of what's going on in the policy space. For example, right now, if you're not working on something that's related to the pandemic or the upcoming stimulus bills, it's probably a hard time to have a conversation about your research with a decision maker. So knowing what's going on, knowing like, is the decision maker, running for re-election, and so they're probably not focused on policy. Is the government shut down? That's also something we need to worry about now. Things like that, thinking about timing. And then, again, communication, I think we already touched on this a little bit, but yeah, making sure it's accessible and keeping it super short so that it's easy for the staffer or decision maker to get through really quickly. And one resource that I will highlight is our Scientist Advocacy Toolkit. You can Google Scientist Advocacy Toolkit. It'll show up on the UCS website. We have a lot of different one-pagers on how to prepare for meetings with legislators, how to put together sort of an elevator pitch to talk about your research or a particular issue. That's really useful. So, and I can make sure that you have that link so we can send it around to participants afterwards too.
Perfect. Thank you. I will collect resources from everybody. I also apologize. I have a very chaotic cat who unfortunately is quarantined with me because I also have a chaotic dog who's in the other room. So I am sorry if there's a cat noises in the background. Okay, Brittany?
Yeah, I feel like I echo everything both of the previous speakers have said. One thing I'll definitely say, I think it's language, but I think it's also cultural. Something we talk about a lot at AGU is, at the end of a scientific paper, that's when you have like the conclusions or like the so what. And often, when you're engaging with, I'm going to say actually anybody else, whether it's like the media or legislators, like that's the first thing they want to know. I always tell people, when thinking about what do you want your legislator to walk away from this meeting with, it's really like why should I care? And then there's a whole lot of preparation to kind of get them to care, which we have tons of resources about. But I think those are the main two barriers. Is you really kind of have to flip upside that kind of triangle. But yeah, AGU has a lot of resources. The public affairs team at AGU is actually part of the larger AGU Sharing Science Network, which is all about helping scientists better communicate, whether that's in the policy realm or with media or, just to your parents at Thanksgiving. And so our website is sciencepolicy.ag.org. And we have a whole ton of resources. I think the one cool thing about the Sharing Science Network is we actually go to universities and do trainings. We've actually been to UMD. It's been a couple of years, but we've definitely been there. And we also, if you ever come to fall meeting, we have a whole space where we offer trainings throughout the week. But we also do webinars. We have toolkits as well. Want to make sure I didn't leave anything out. But I also would say that also, if you're not ready, or another good opportunity is, and we're not the only scientific society that does fly-ins or congressional visits days, but they almost always have like a half-day workshop, and that can be a really good opportunity to get some really good training. So I would say, these are a couple of options, but I imagine almost any scientific society that you're a part of probably offers similar resources and training as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. No matter what your field is, there's probably some field-specific materials for you coming out of whatever organization your field is affiliated with. Okay, so next question. What is the best way to become knowledgeable about the policy relevance of your work when you're starting a new project? And how would you recommend talking about the importance of research that may not have direct policy relevancy, such as basic physics research? And Brittany, you can go.
Yeah, so, the first thing that really occurred to me is I would talk to your society government relations folks or your institutional relations folks. Like I'm sure UMD has, federal, probably state, and maybe even local people who specialize in, working with legislators on all of those levels. And I would say tapping into their brains, but also their connections. Like you don't need to do it all. I would say there are a couple of great newsletters out there. One that I specifically really like, and there's no subscription, is the American Institute of Physics has an FYI newsletter that I think is really great. And I also think Science Policy Twitter, even if you're not active, is a really great news source. So following like AGU Science Policy Twitter is, I think, a great way to get a lot of that science policy news. But I would definitely say, go to the experts. This is our full-time job. And also, the other half of my full-time job is helping people. And I love to help people. And we don't get nearly enough requests from our members. And to the second half of your question, I would say I always encourage people, because we have a lot of members who do space science type work, which can often sometimes seem, the three key messages that AGU we tend to use is kind of like economics, national security, and kind of public health and well-being. And, sometimes we have space science people who are like, I don't really think studying Europa has anything to do with that. But, I often encourage people to take a step back. Studying planetary analogs is really important for understanding Earth and kind of where Earth fits into the grand scheme of things. And that allows us to understand a whole lot of other things. So really take a step back and think about the broader context of your work. And also, I think scientists tend to be very narrow, but policymakers in general are thinking much broader than that. So kind of like, where do you fit into the big picture? But I would also say, you're probably studying that because you're excited about that type of work, and just sharing that story can really be a way to tap into legislators' interest and excitement of science, because I think there's this awe-inspiring aspect of science that you shouldn't be afraid to tap into. And you can also always tell your science story. So for a lot of people, I talked to this woman who studies pulsars at West Virginia because Green Bank Telescope is there. But she could tell her story about what brought her to West Virginia. West Virginia doesn't have a huge population. So just talking about how she's there and now she's educating a bunch of people and she's bringing so many people into the scientific workforce. So, you can tell a broader story and then how you fit into that story.
Awesome. Thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a huge +1 to everything that Brittany said. I totally agree. I mean, I don't want to repeat anything, but like, yes, I have heard this question from so many scientists about like, oh, well, my dissertation is on this. Like, how can I talk about this with a decision maker? And it's like, well, they honestly probably don't care about your dissertation. I'm really sorry. But scientists have so much more to offer, including just being able to, know where to look for reputable data and sources that could be, policy relevant that decision makers might need access to or might need to know about. Your ability to just think critically on issues, I think, is really important for policy. So do keep that bigger picture in mind. I would also suggest, start building a relationship with your elected officials based on the fact that you're a constituent, and then ask them how your work is policy relevant. See, there may be connections that you wouldn't have thought of on your own, that may feel really tangential to you, but that could end up being super useful for a policy that they are working on or have gotten questions about. I think I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And finally, Kavita?
Great. I also agree with all the points raised here. I'll just try to talk about a little bit different perspective. So just as it's important to communicate your own research, it's also important to see what is being communicated in your area of work. And so I typed in some resources in the chat box. I think the Science Journal, their policy forum, another journal, Issues in Science and Technology, The Conversation, they all translate a lot of scientific research into outlets that people find easier to read. And so I would keep track of the areas that you're interested in by just reading beyond your academic journals and academic research in those areas. And there are two other ways in which you can be aware of what's going on beyond your own research work. So one is there are hundreds of people, for example, at UMD who work on climate and energy related topics. So you could be working on energy storage, but for material science, but there could be somebody in the public policy school who's analyzing policies on energy storage and who's aware of a different perspective on that topic. So that's a very easy way to engage with a broader group of people who are working on the same area that you are. And another also relatively easy way is that at least at UMD, we have this lucky situation to be in the DC area where there are hundreds of talks every day on every topic, and they're open to the public. They're all policy relevant. So I find it useful for myself to be part of these conversations on campus and outside to make sure that my work remains policy relevant and that it's on top of what other people are talking about. And just by reading and engaging with the community around you, that it makes it easier to do that. And of course, you should engage with the legislators and the policymakers, but there are also some other steps you can take.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So for our final question, I believe I'm trying to mix the order up. I think it's Melissa first this time. Sorry. Sorry, I'm trying to post this and I seem to be having some technical issues. There we go. Okay, so we often think that research needs to address national or international policies and questions, but local and regional studies can also be very important. How does framing your research to local or regional decision makers change compared to national or international ones? Do you have any examples of how scientists shared their local regional research with key community players to drive change?
Yes, I love this question. I think that having examples of local studies or local impacts is always important to a policymaker. And I think the more local the policymaker, the more important those local examples are. And I want to go back to something I said before, which is I think relationship building is also really critical to engaging in policy. Building relationships with policymakers, with community members, with the media, to learn about what's going on in the policy realm and where you can make the most impact and get involved. One example that I'll share from UCS is from Wilmington, Delaware, where some of my colleagues, scientists and analysts, put together a report looking at cumulative impacts from different health and safety issues that were causing a higher risk for low-income communities of color there. And the community leaders used this report to get their city council to pass a cumulative impacts resolution, which requires the state board, it has a super long name. It's essentially like the state EPA, to consider multiple sources of pollution before granting permits in those communities. So it's a huge win for these communities and can hopefully set a precedent across the state. But the reason I highlight this is because we used publicly available data from the federal government, focusing in on the local level, and we're able to communicate it in a way that was accessible to those local community members that they could then use to talk to their decision makers about it. So this is a case where you don't even have to necessarily run, local research projects or, start a whole new effort. There is a lot of data out there that just isn't accessible to local people who need it. So that's another way of thinking about engaging in policy at the local level.
Awesome. Brittany?
Yeah, I feel like I echo everything, it's just going to be a theme. I think one thing I thought about though is I think you have to be aware of like where the decision-making power lies. So, I think it's important to not be asking your decision makers for something they can't do. This is something we kind of talk a lot about at the federal level. Sometimes a letter to the governor from, both of your senators might be powerful, but some things are just state decisions. And so I think just keeping in mind where the decision-making power lies so that when you talk to your legislators, you're actually having a conversation that's relevant to them and kind of the power that they have. So AGU actually last year wrote a report that really kind of talks about this issue exactly. It's called Surging Waters. And so it's about kind of the topic of flooding, but using flooding really as an example to showcase how science can be used kind of at all levels to help solve problems, I'll say. And so we picked the topic of flooding because flooding happens in every county in America, but it happens differently, right? So I'm from Georgia originally, and hurricanes are the thing for us. But if you live in the Midwest, they get really bad storms. And so the issues are different, even though basically we're all dealing with the same issue. And so I'll type in a link in the box, but the Surging Waters is basically one, it's multiple case studies from 3 different regions. We also talk about coastal flooding in the report, and kind of talking about how science is helping local communities solve these problems. And a lot of times what it is like providing that access to federal data and being able to read that data. And I would just also say that if this is something you're interested in, community science is of an interest of AGU, and we have like a Thriving Earth Exchange project that does a lot of this type of work. And I know just really trying to connect lawmakers to their local policymakers, because I think more and more scientists want to see their science used for good. Because I think when you're working at the local and state level, I think you see results a lot faster. And so I think it can be more rewarding in some ways.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I'm starting to lose track of who's answered what questions. Kavita?
Yeah, it's me.
Okay.
Thanks. Also echoing what I think data is really valuable at the local and regional level, and it's not always collected or analyzed as it is at the federal level. So also fully echo those points. I have a recent example of something we did that is that won't repeat the points that came up earlier, which is I mentioned this report on a couple of reports on regional energy innovation. So a challenge with energy is that it's much harder to pass policies or to talk about policies in the climate context. But when you talk about co-benefits of those energy, so for example, for economic development or something else, that has a lot more excitement around it. So the relevance of all of this to science is that science and technology and innovation are precursors to economic development. This is just largely true. So what we did in these reports is talk about how at a regional level in Maryland, these can interact. So what are the science and technology strands in Maryland's universities? And then what are the energy relevant policies that are in the state, and do they actually interact? Are we building a clean energy based economy that is using the strengths of our university system and the workforce, and does it really lead to the broader climate and energy goals? And this report went to Governor Hogan, so it was it clearly had a policy audience. Similarly, we've worked on this other regional report, which we communicated with the House Subcommittee on Science and Science-Based Technology. So the point just being that I think regional and local research is really important again, and there is a lot more interest in acting on that. And although you did mention in the question that national and international policies we feel that that's important, but there's clearly a trend coming up that more and more people are interested in what is local and how things are decentralized. So I don't think that there should be any, in my view, difference between national, international, or local. They're all equally important.
Thank you. I think that's sort of a good message. Don't feel that it's lesser if it's at a smaller level. Did everybody get a chance to answer every question? I'm sorry, I'm just, this is a little confusing. Like I said, this is my first time hosting a webinar. Okay, in that case, let's open it up to questions. Thank you so much to all our panelists for their thoughtful answers. And now, if any of the participants would like to ask a question, like I said before, please just type the word stack into the group chat, and then I will call on people in order. And if you have a specific panelist you'd like an answer from, you can specify, or if you'd like everybody to take a stab at your question. And in the okay, Liz.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to say to the panelists, I guess since we all have our video and microphones off, you can't see, but or at least I have been smiling and laughing and enjoying this whole thing. So thank you so much. All the answered so one thing I'm curious though, and I think you may have touched on it a little bit, but it is going back to communicating with policymakers as a scientist. Something that I guess we've talked about in our group is writing for a journal doesn't necessarily make for easy policy reading. It can be very technical. And so I'm curious, what types of documents, what sorts of things as scientists, if we're interested in engaging with policy, kind of what's the right mechanism, or what's the right type of writing or place to be writing, since publishing our work in a journal is not going to make it into the hands of a decision maker. So if you could comment on that. And that's not really directed to anyone in particular, anyone who is interested in answering.
I can jump in. I'm sure others have thoughts as well, but in general, if you're going to hand something directly to a policymaker, I always recommend a 1 to 2, preferably 1-page sort of document that is relatively high level, to be honest. Echoing what Brittany said at the beginning, starting with the bottom line up front, in bold, large font at the top, and then any sort of supporting details or research or supporting evidence that you want to highlight beneath that relates to the policy or ask that you're there to talk with them about. So I think that's great if you're having a direct meeting with a decision maker or one of their staff. I also recommend op-eds in local papers, because decision makers do pay attention to what's published in their local papers, especially if it's on a particular policy or is policy relevant. So that's a good way to get their attention in a little bit more of an indirect way.
Just to quickly add to that, I've had a really good experience with the conversation. So they publish research it in a easy to communicate manner by researchers directly. So in my experience, what happened was that I had a journal paper. I wrote a piece for the conversation. It's very short, 800 words. They help you with the writing and the editing. And then that piece was picked up by many other media outlets. So it just had so much more outreach than it would have only as a journal paper alone. So op-eds definitely, and also think about these smaller things, blog posts, or the conversation is also great. Other things like that can help more people read your work in a simple way. Doesn't stop you from writing your research papers, but then think of the bottom line up front and then write that in 500 or 600 words and then get that out.
Awesome, thank you. Brittany, did you want to chime in, or should we move to the next question?
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Oh, okay, great. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. This has been a really great discussion so far. My question is more kind of following up with the local research side of things. My research is local in nature, but it's dealing with observations of air pollution over a location in China outside of Beijing. And I don't speak Chinese. I've never been to China. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about things that I could do to communicate my research with people in China that could help make decisions about air quality findings.
I'm just going to jump in here and just say, Sarah, you should just get in touch with other people who are working on China, and they may have contacts. I don't know them. I don't have them myself, but for example, in the School of Public Policy, in our center, we have a big research program on China. So, and we work directly with many of the policymakers there. So again, I think looking broadly at the university and who else may be doing the kind of things you're doing, maybe in a different department, can be a way of making those connections. People in the university are generally friendly and happy to help you with that.
Great, thanks.
Does anybody else want to chime in? Okay, so Nicole?
Hi, I have a question for Kavita. When you transitioned out of academia, I was wondering what kind of skills you emphasized when you made the transition from a CV to a resume. I know it's hard for a lot of us to kind of back off of the emphasis on our research, and I was wondering how much of that you do emphasize and how much of it you kind of replace with other things.
So it's a really good question. For a long time, I felt that I should hide my research, but actually that's not a good approach. You should highlight the strengths of what you have been doing. So I think some of those strengths can be, it doesn't have to be for everyone, but quantitative skills, analysis, data analysis, thinking of problems in depth. Those are the type of things you learn during your PhD. Especially in some scientific fields, you just have to work with so much data. Not everybody is able to do that. So I highlighted that when I worked in the consulting firm, just my ability to think in structures. I think that was the main thing for me. The part that I didn't highlight was that I had not written any policy type documents. So I tried to not talk about that and build on that. So focus on your strengths that you think would be relevant, and also happy to talk more after.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I wonder if our other panelists have a thought on that from the sort of other side of the conversation as non-scientists working in the field.
Just echo a lot of what she said. I think I talk a lot I talk a lot about like law school in terms of like the training it provides, and I think talking about your research experience like that as well, I think is such a value add to so many organizations.
I agree.
Okay, so it is technically 1 o'clock, but we have a couple more questions. So if any of our panelists need to leave, that's completely understandable. But if you do have the time to hang around and answer a couple more questions, that would be great, but completely up to you since our official time is over. Megan?
Hi, this question is for Melissa. You talked about earlier how if we were interested in getting in touch with you about Union of Concerned Scientists and kind of a little bit more on what that nonprofit does, we could contact you. Is there the best way to do that, by email or find you online or whatever?
Yes, I'm going to type my email into the chat right now. You can also follow us on Twitter at SciNetUCS and reach out directly there if Twitter is your thing, or check out our website and sign up if you want to receive our sort of broader email updates through there. But you can reach out to me directly, and I look forward to connecting with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Maida?
Thanks, Aditi, for organizing this, and to all the panelists. This has been really great. I had a really, I guess, sort of narrow question. I am a member of the Ecological Society of America, and on their website, they have this really neat tool. It's a Federal Register tracker. So they keep track of opportunities to provide public comments, of public meetings that various federal agencies and offices are holding. And I've always been kind of intrigued by it. So I'm curious for our speakers or panelists, if you think that submitting comments in response to those kinds of solicitations are useful, or if there are kind of basically better ways to spend your time.
I'll jump in. I think responding to requests for public comments is really important and is a great opportunity to practice sort of getting involved in, I guess that's more of the regulatory process, but practicing the type of communication that is valuable for policy engagement. Actually, the Union of Concerned Scientists has a request out now for scientists to weigh in on a current rule. And we have a public comment guide available. I'll also try to find this link and send it in the chat, or we can send it around later. And that walks through sort of how to write a more effective comment. I think all public comments are valuable and all of them must be read by law. So anything that you write carries at least a little bit of weight. So keep that in mind. But there are ways to more effectively engage and spend your time on this. So if you haven't checked out some of those resources from groups like UCS, or the Public Comment Project is another great resource. That's a good way to make sure that anytime you are spending on public comments is well spent.
I would just add to that you know, sometimes in advocacy, it's all about, you know, having that coalition letter where 100 people have signed it. But public comments generally are more in the vein of you need more people to weigh in individually. So I think any comment you can add is really effective. And I would also say, if this is something you're really concerned about, this is also a time to engage, I would say, your legislators and get them to write a comment, because a comment from a federal official or a state or local official can also be very, I'll say their opinions might get a little more weight. But definitely encourage you to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So again, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to give each of you guys maybe just a few seconds if you have a final comment or like a thesis statement that you'd like our participants to take away today. Any final words? Brittany, you can go for it.
Sure. I would just say what I always encourage our members is that you're not just a scientist, you're a constituent scientist. And I think it's important for you to feel empowered, especially because you're bringing such a unique perspective to so many different discussions. And I think, you know, now more than ever, sorry, I hate that phrase. I feel like in the time of COVID, I've been using it daily. But regardless, even before COVID, I think science plays such an important role in society that I think at whatever level you want to engage or whoever you want to engage with, just know that I think you're definitely bringing a value add. So don't hesitate. And I would also say, feel free to reach out to me or anyone else or your other scientific societies. I know we're always, we're here to help. This is what we do, and we're happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you. Kavita?
Yeah, I also agree. I think science is, again, increasingly important and will continue to be. It's overwhelming sometimes. It has been for me to communicate in a way that is necessary to communicate with policy, but there are lots of easy steps you can do, which is just stay on top of, you know, read well, stay on top of your research area beyond your own research, and engage with the networks, as Brittany mentioned. There's many connections you can make that are really easy and that can help you build towards actually engaging with the policymakers.
Awesome. Thank you. Melissa?
Well, I won't repeat that awesome advice from both Brittany and Kavita, but I will say vote. It's really important to make sure that you are registered and make a plan to vote in the upcoming primaries and/or general election if your primary has already passed. I'm definitely not going to get partisan here, but I think regardless of what issues you care about or where you stand politically, it's really important to make sure that everyone is participating in our democracy in that realm as well. So please make sure you check your registration. You can do it online and it takes less than 2 minutes.
I think that was a really, really excellent closing statement. I mainly am dying to get citizenship so that I can vote. It's like my only reason I want that in my future. I'm very excited to vote one day. I've never lived in a country where I could vote, so that's sad. But thank you so much to our panelists. I think this was a really wonderful and informative discussion. I know we got a lot of resources shared in the chat, and I will compile those all into an email and send it around to everybody who participated today. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.